Hey everyone, I'm Jack.
And I'm Alex.
And in today's video, we'll be ranking the bosses of Santa Monica Studios' God of War 3 in a special non-Wednesday upload as an appetizer for tomorrow's God of War Ragnarok release. Heralded as one of the great games of the 7th console generation, God of War 3 remains to this day an all-time classic, stemming from its cathartic combat, mesmerizing set-piece and world design, gameplay evolutions, and improvements on advancements made in God of War 2, and its bosses. As in most games, each major story beat of God of War 3 was capped off with a boss fight, all massive in scale and majority executed with the masterful discipline you'd expect of seasoned developers such as Santa Monica. In a rare case of all-around boss quality, there's not a single stinker on this list, but there are absolutely clear favorites as you'll come to see. Nonetheless, finishing off Kratos' war on Olympus in the way it happens was what I describe as narrative perfection, flawless execution with consistent pacing and impactful events occurring constantly. As I've already briefly gone over, the bosses that make up the majority of said impactful events were incredibly good, and experiencing this game for the first time was a gaming memory I'll treasure for a long time. With that said, let's get into the ranking.
You may have noticed the lack of a distinct Jack's ranking and Alex's ranking on the slides here. That's because by some miraculous fluke, we actually had the same exact ranking for all 8 bosses in an unprecedented case in Psychonauts history. The game starts with a bang, beginning with all the big 3 gods setting off to fight back the Titans and Kratos from the peak of Olympus. Hades, god of the underworld, Zeus, god of lightning, and finally Poseidon, god of also lightning? I don't know what else to call this because it sure isn't water. Poseidon does nothing but electrify the floor or stab with its trident. You've basically seen it all after 30 seconds of fighting him. He has one of the most iconic finishers of the series, although I wouldn't say it's one of my favorites. A lot of the most brutal ones come from cool encounters that aren't even boss fights, like tearing Helios' head off or fucking Hephaestus' wife. The whole seeing it from Poseidon's perspective thing isn't as cool to me as it is to most people, and there isn't much other than that to make it special. With simplistic and at times dull gameplay that is shown up by earlier sequences, one could rather ironically say he's like the hippocampus but watered down.
Before we delve into my take on Hermes, it's worth noting that we're only counting what we ended up deeming as the actual fight, beginning with the boulder catapult onwards, meaning the chase is excluded. I originally had Hermes at dead last because of the chase sequence, but once again we decided on just talking about the fight itself. Makes the script a lot shorter, I guess. There's not much to Hermes, to be honest. After endlessly following the messenger god for minutes on end, he's in utter shock when Kratos is able to not just reach him, but gravely injure him as well. The fight's kind of like killing an injured animal if they had, like, rabies, if that makes it a bit less messed up. He doesn't ever really fight back, and it's just a time waster, really. If you've played Dark Souls 2 up to Brightstone Cove Seldora, it's similar to fighting Prowling Magus and co, except I think it's actually impossible to die to Hermes even if you tried, but somehow the fight's still decently engaging. I actually had an audible reaction to ripping off his legs though, like totally fucking crazy.
Oh! Oh my... Jeez! Holy shit! What the fuck? Oh no. Oh! Oh! That's like Looney Tunes.
Somewhat embarrassingly, Poseidon is shown up by his watery steed that attacks you within the opening 5 or so minutes of the game. Non-god status aside, that doesn't make this cinematic introduction any less badass. This thing is bitching Gaia mid-diff for the entire area, with small interludes requiring you to lend her a hand to fend it off. The variation is impressive and keeps it fresh, between hanging on the roof with the chains, holding onto a wall, and the occasional good old-fashioned wall boss segment that God of War so loves. I'll admit that the chain segments aren't particularly fun because the movement is limited to mashing square then dashing away until it's over, but it doesn't last long enough to become an actual hassle. Between hacking up its claws and butchering its jaw, this is the balls-to-the-wall first boss that every action game should start off with done pretty well.
Out of all the bosses, Scorpius is easily the least interesting to me. Its historical implications aren't nearly as obvious as any of the others, which is a bit of an unfair comparison, gods to fauna. But the fight is still enjoyable and makes use of the Nemean Cestus, my third favorite weapon in the game behind Helios' head and the Blades of Exile, and Alex's favorite weapon. It's widely believed that Scorpius is God of War's representation of Scorpius, the scorpion sent by Gaia to kill Orion, both of whom became constellations that rise when the other falls. It's pretty neat when you research it, but it's not like fucking Zeus or something obviously connected to mythology. Onto the fight, unlike any other boss, Scorpius forces a single mechanic. Its entire body is coated in the stated to be unbreakable crystal structures that actually are breakable, you just need gloves. Really extravagant gloves. Stupid joke. His body is covered in the crystals you break with the Nemean Cestus, and as such, you slowly break off his legs one by one with QuickTime's headlining phase transitions. The fight is infested with Scorpius spawns. In another Dark Souls 2 reference, Scorpius is eerily similar to the Duke's Freya in both first and second phase. The second phase isn't much different from the first in overall approach, but the main change is Scorpius only comes in from the far left corner of the labyrinth box and on a set timer. I recommend using Nemean Roar as often as possible to take out both the legs and spawns in one AoE, especially if you upgraded it to weapon level 5 generally early like Alex and I did. Scorpius' fight was fun from beginning to end, climaxing with one of the God of War series' most underrated QTEs.
The King of the Gods does not fuck around. While he may not be the best fight in the game, he is the hardest by an impossibly large margin. When I replayed the game on Titan difficulty to get the Platinum Trophy, he absolutely brutalized me for quite some time. The Street Fighter style first phase is the easiest. Once you get behind him and parry his basic combos, you can absolutely wail on him with barely any thought. If you use the Nemean Cestus for almost everything like I did, you might have found that mashing the triangle combos can effectively juggle him in midair and leave him helpless to loads of damage. Even if you fight him fair and square, his moves are all fairly telegraphed, making for a fun but simple fight that has a bit more health than I think it should. The real deal starts when you both get vored by a vengeful Gaia and have to finish the fight inside the heart chamber from where it all began. If done well, I'm a big fan of bosses where you both have access to healing, since it makes a really tense back and forth if done right. This fight isn't as good as, say, Senator Armstrong from Metal Gear Rising, but its heart is in the right place. Clever, aren't I? Anyways, this phase does not fuck around. I spent a ridiculous amount of time in Titan mode getting my sphincter blown open by lightning bolts and clone punches until I learned 3 pieces of valuable information. 1. You can parry the clone attack and lightning bolts. 2. You can both prevent his healing and give yourself some by attacking Gaia's heart every now and then. And lastly, L1 plus circle is a broken ass move to spam. Once you piece this all together, you've got the tools and just need the skill to make it happen. That final QuickTime event where you fight to push him back with a sort of Olympus had me stressed beyond belief. Failing QTEs is not just humiliating but can doom you if you don't nail him. The main cons are that the only real ways to get the fight down are cheesing him with relentless offense, and he has a rather small attack pool for a final boss. I don't know if it's just me, but games are supposed to sell you illusions, and the cracks started showing a bit here due to the sheer length of the fight. I also thought the whole Spirit Zeus bit was dumb, and that section where you just wander around was boring as shit, but I can forgive them since I guess they needed to put story beats in somehow, just wish it was less lengthy and ham-fisted. Zeus is a slight letdown compared to the insanity of some bosses before him, but still offers a satisfying challenge to overcome, and ending the King of the Gods is quite literally an Olympian feat.
As much as I enjoyed God of War 2018, what it was missing was irrational Kratos. I like to call him Asura Kratos. The emotional dips in Hercules' introduction is exactly what I'm talking about, going from brotherly love and Kratos telling Hercules not to spar, to bashing his fucking head in only a minute or 2 later. This game's finishers are easily the best of any game I've played, or at least of any game that comes to mind while scripting this bit at 2 in the morning, and Hercules had me squirming like I was greening out because of the utter barbarian brutality. It was like that one scene from the Batman where he beats the shit out of the Riddler goon. Good movie, not great. Anyways, I actually played Dante's Inferno before playing any of the God of War series, and I can say with assurance that Hercules feels the most similar to a boss from that game, which is a good thing and a bad thing. A lot of the bosses in Dante's Inferno share a reliance on enemies that Hercules also has. It's not until a few minutes in and multiple waves of soldiers that Hercules actually enters the fray. From then on, the fight focuses more and more on the backlogged son of Zeus. I actually really sympathized with Hercules with his anger towards Kratos, but like any power fantasy, taking on and defeating a massively superior being is just all around enjoyable even if you aren't necessarily the moral protagonist. It's a bit unclear as to how you damage the God of Heroes in Phase 1. For a minute I just hit him to where he keeled over and then ran until he regained his strength, but you're supposed to nail him into the thorn wall. After repeating this process a couple of times, Kratos breaks off his helmet and Phase 2 begins. This marks the end of enemy padding and instead the fight switches to a 1v1. It becomes a lot more tactical in how you approach him, although take my use of the word tactical with a grain of salt. God of War 3's combat is one of those where you can just sort of turn off your mind while doing it and you'll be alright. After you hit him enough, Hercules will run to a thorned wall and chuck it at you. He does this a bit too many times to keep it real, and you might think you need to let yourself get hit by it, but you don't. It's just an exceptionally long phase. This marks where you gain the Nemean Cestus. My god, was it awesome. Thugging gauntlets off of Hercules and then using them to end him was extremely satisfying. With a fitting and brutal ending QuickTime, Hercules easily earns a top 3 spot on this list with minimal competition.
The gap between Hades and Kronos was quite thin for me and I had a hard time choosing a top dog. Hades just barely lagged behind, but he's still an amazing fight all the same. For one, he has a cool ass start to the fight where he ambushes you with the chains and you have to stave him off before the fight proper begins. I suppose he would be mad considering you just blew a hole in the wall of his room using the coffin of his dead bitch wife. Sorry, champ. His design is the coolest of all the bosses by a mile, and his weapons are similar to Kratos' own, which makes for an interesting parallel. The arena is perfectly sized, and Hades has probably the most varied and engaging moveset in the game. He's got swipes, his big jump attack, and a myriad of other moves that are clearly distinct from one another. The way you kill him is metal as fuck also, literally ripping off chunks of flesh and then finishing them off while they try to sentiently reattach themselves. This fight has 3 phases also, which is quite a few for a purely one-on-one combat boss. The first one is the best, although the others are solid as well. The second phase is kinda like the hippocampus upside down bits where you can't do all that much, but it looks cool and doesn't last long enough to get irritating. The ending stretch was a total surprise, but badass nonetheless, with his whole melted flesh look. Hades gets like 3 of the most brutal and satisfying finisher animations of the entire game, between tearing off his skin, bludgeoning him against the roof with his own chains, and ripping out his immortal soul with the hooks. With this fight coming in the opening hours of the game, it set an incredibly high standard for everything to come, which was thankfully surpassed at least one time later on.
I'm sure a great many God of War fans that played this game when it came out were groaning with agony upon seeing Kronos again, infamously the wielder of Pandora's Temple, a notorious arc in the first God of War, to keep it light. To make a touchy analogy, however, that Kronos was like Hitler and this Kronos is like the Buddha or something. Without getting any more offensive, this is the absolute pinnacle of spectacular boss design. My use of the word spectacular is twofold as well. Not only is the fight spectacular in the sense of it being just fun, but defeating the King of the Titans in the Pit of Tartarus is quite literally a large-scale spectacle nailed to perfection. Cause and effect in God of War 3's exposition is part of why all the bosses in this game feel so important. The reason you're fighting Kronos is to steal the Omphale Stone from his innards so Hephaestus can craft you a god-slaying weapon. Of course, we all know how that went. But unlike a lot of games, you have a clear purpose and reason as to why you're fighting every boss, Kronos being no exception. I'm a sucker for larger-than-life bosses and slowly making your way around them. Great examples of this aside from Kronos would be Megaleg from Mario Galaxy or any of the enjoyable Colossi from Shadow of the Colossus. However, Kronos is undoubtedly the best grand-scale boss I've ever fought. The variation in combat and traversal was extraordinary, and somehow nearly every mechanic in the game was implemented at some point. I also found the way you slowly chip away at Kronos before eventually ripping apart his intestines from the inside out genius and logical. Each passing event in the fight makes Kratos appear more powerful than ever before, especially the opening palm crush, then continuing with ripping off Kronos' fingernail and eventually stabbing him in the head, a fatal blow to the founder of Olympus. As by far the most memorable and variational boss in any God of War game, Kronos is widely considered one of the greatest bosses of all time. For Alex and I, Kronos was easily the best in this game, for Kratos an Olympic accomplishment, and as a spectacle fight, a genre of bosses we tend to favor, could very well be our favorite boss of all time.
Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. We're working as quickly as possible to put out a video on God of War Ragnarok, so stay tuned for that coming very soon. That's all for now. Deuces.